Hello and welcome to the World Built Environment Forum webinar series. My name's Simon Rubinsohn, and in today's webinar we will be looking at what is currently going on in the housing sector, both in Europe and in North America, and then we will go on to consider how best to address some of the big challenges in the area. I've got a really good panel to work through some of the key issues with me today. And what I want to do is introduce each of them in turn, ask them to say a few words about themselves before we get going on the conversation. So let me first introduce my first panelist, Carol Abbey from CDC Habitat. Good afternoon, Carol.
Good afternoon, Simon. Thank you for welcoming me today. So I'm part of the executive committee of CDC Habitat, which is a subsidiary of the French sovereign wealth fund Caisse des Dépôts. We are a housing investor and manager with more than 500,000 units under management today.
Well, welcome, Carol, and looking forward to the conversation. My next panelist is Lucian Cook, MRICS, I should say, and he's from Savills. Lucian, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Simon. A pleasure to be with you this afternoon. Really looking forward to the debate. So I'm Lucian. I work for the Savills Real Estate Advisory. I run a team of about 30 researchers who look at pretty much every aspect of the UK housing market, from investment to development, to the sales market. So I'm intrigued to see some of the parallels as what's going on in my world with some of the other panelists.
Thanks, Lucian. From Germany, I'd like to now welcome Andreas Trumpp, FRICS, from Colliers International.
Yes, hello, good afternoon also from my end. My name is Andreas. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. I'm heading a team of 20+ analysts across Germany, yeah, I'm a managing director, head of market intelligence and Foresight, also known as research, and I'm looking forward to the debate.
Thank you and welcome, Andreas. And my last panelist, I think it's fair to say it is good afternoon, to Stephen J. Schleider, FRICS from JLL, based in New York.
Hi, thank you, Simon, and appreciate the opportunity to be a panelist here. I'm Steve Schleider, Senior Managing Director with JLL's Value and Risk Advisory practice here in the US. I'm FRICS, and I hold the MAI designation, and I'm also a lead accredited professional with specialty in building design and construction. Our JLL US practice covers appraisal services, market and feasibility studies, environmental and property condition services, strategic advisory, and other practice lines such as complex litigation, compliance, and even tax certiorari. We have over, well, I think we did about 14,000 assignments for our group. We have about 300 valuation professionals here in the US, and this was during 2023. Assets valued in 2023 approached probably about $500 billion in the US. Worldwide, JLL has about 2,100 value and risk advisory professionals, and we have a very active practice in Europe, Asia, United States, North and South America. It's global.
Well, welcome, Stephen, and we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts on a number of the key issues around housing. Now, just to remind everybody who is dialed into the webinar that we really want this session to be as interactive as possible. I think it can get a bit sort of repetitive if I'm just asking the panelists and we're not getting your insights. So we really would like to sort of hear any thoughts that you have, and certainly any questions that you would like to pose to the panel. You can use the chat function and the questions will just come through to us and we will take them in due course, but we really do want to hear from you, so don't be shy. Now, I think, in terms of the starting point, I think what I would like to get from each of the panelists is just their thoughts regarding the current dynamics and trends shaping the housing market in its wider sense in their country or their region. So let me start, the other side of the pond. Stephen, I mean, just get some thoughts as to how you see what's going on in the housing sector in North America.
Sure. All right. Well, we have a couple of key themes that we're going to be working with here in 2024. Cap rates for core properties, for core locations, sub 5 to a bit over 5%. Core plus is going to be 5 to about 5.5%. Value add is going to be about high 5s, going to 6.5. We had housing starts peak in the fourth quarter of 2022, and deliveries will peak in the second half of 2024. But we don't see pricing power really coming to return to the second half of 25. So I can stop there, but if you want to talk about how balanced is supply versus potential demand for housing stock, we can either go into that now or come back to that.
Well, let's come back to that. But, it's interesting what you're saying, that you think that delivery is going to peak later in the year. And that raises some interesting issues that we can definitely return to. So, Andreas, what's the story in Germany in terms of the sort of the major sort of themes at the moment that people are talking about?
I mean, I could talk for hours, but I will stop immediately after giving some insights, and we will certainly speak about supply, demand, affordability later on. But if we look at the investment markets, I think markets have also seen some kind of a standstill. Not really. I mean, a couple of deals are going on, but if we look at investment volumes down 40% year over year, only roughly 9 billion last year. We had a quite slow start to this year. Repricing was one of the key themes in the last year. I think we've seen initial yields moving out by 80 to 100 basis points. By 80 to 100 basis points, just to be clear. I mean, that is one of the key themes for investors at the moment. If we look at the rental markets, I mean, there is this huge imbalance between high demand in the major conurbations and the very low supply. So a couple of key themes that are contributing to a situation that is often a bit unclear, that is often a bit going to a polarization in the markets.
Okay, thank you, Andreas. And I can already think that there's some overlap with some of the other themes that we know we've already heard from Stephen and what we're going to hear. Lucian, what about the UK perspective on this?
Yeah, well, I'd probably say the UK perspective, the overriding theme is one of affordability. So like many other parts of the globe, we saw quite a lot of capital value appreciation in the wake of the pandemic, particularly when you were able to lock into relatively low interest rates. The experience of the lockdown was a very strong catalyst to move. But no, that has been, without any shadow of a doubt, sort of brought rather abruptly to a halt by the increase in the cost of mortgage debt. Particularly successive increases to bank base rate. That's sort of made housing affordability a much more topical issue. Again, even in the rented sector, you've got similar things. A very strong burst of rental growth has also been seen. So that means that housing generally is being pushed up the political agenda. More recently, we've seen a bit more stability in the mortgage markets of late. I think the narrative has started to change as to when we're now going to see our first interest rate cuts. That's quite an important point for sentiment, I would say, within the UK housing market. And then finally, in terms of supply, housing supply, slightly weaker market conditions over the past 12 months has coincided with the withdrawal of a bit of support for the house builders over here. As a consequence, we're seeing levels of housing delivery fall. But the consequence of that is, again, housing goes up the political agenda, particularly as we approach a general election, probably later in the year here in the UK.
Thank you. Thanks, Lucian. Again, lots of issues that we will come back to there. And in terms of just finishing this round off, Carol, from a French perspective, and indeed from CDC's perspective, what are the big stories at the moment? What in terms of the trend shaping your business's activity in the housing market at the moment?
Yes, of course, in France we see exactly the same trends. with rising interest rates, we see that affordability is a real issue, and people have lost about 25% in terms of affordability, in terms of purchasing power in France. So we have this crisis, which is both a demand crisis from the individuals, but also the institutional investors, as in other countries. I guess in France, their orders of new housing has decreased by 50% in 2023, and we don't see them coming back on the market at this moment. So this is this demand side, and there is also the offer side of the crisis, which is very strong, as a lot of development projects are abandoned, and this is becoming very high on the agenda of the government also, because we see a lot of developers announcing redundancies, and now construction companies also announcing potential redundancies. And we know that this will be a big problem for the offer over the 2 or 3 next years. So these are really the key themes at the moment, even though we start to see some light at the end of the tunnel. As Lucian was saying, the rates are not increasing anymore, and interest rates on mortgages are starting to decrease a little bit. So we think that the activity could be picking up, but we don't think that it will have a lot of impact before the end of the year.
Okay, thank you. And I think each of you, to some extent, mentioned the word affordability, and I suppose that's where I want to sort of go next, just trying to understand the extent of the challenge there. I mean, it probably is, you know, it's broader based than just the sales market. It's probably the rental market, and even if we're thinking about interest rates coming down, and I think in all cases we probably are. They're not going back to where they were, so there's going to be, perhaps a different playing field going forward to the one that perhaps we got accustomed to in the wake of the GFC. And if we look at the rental market, I mean, rental growth may be slowing, but it's not negative. So starting off with Lucian, because you were quite specific about talking about the affordability. I mean, I'm just wondering how you see this issue playing out now, and what you talked about the politics and moving up the agenda there, but is there a lot of rhetoric there and no action type stuff? I mean, what how do you see this developing?
Yeah, well, look, I the fact that interest rates went up so dramatically, really interesting that Carol talked about the impact which that had on buyers' purchasing power. It had exactly the same impact here in the UK in terms of reducing buyers' purchasing power. I suppose what we didn't see, which we've seen in a lot of other periods where we've had stress in the housing market, is we didn't see a lot of repossessions hit the market. We didn't see a flood of stock. We didn't see people handing back their keys. And I think there are a few reasons for that. One, we've been in an era post-GFC of quite high levels of mortgage regulation that insulated the UK housing market to a degree. Equally, we've seen a bit of a shift in the terms upon which people take their mortgage debt in the UK. A lot more people on longer term fixed rate mortgages. So that meant that a lot of people have essentially been able to ride the storm. And they haven't been exposed to those increased interest rates. And I would also say from a lender's perspective, they've taken quite a benevolent approach to those people who are really facing significant financial pressures. And they have generally stepped in to help them, either extending their mortgage terms or changing their mortgage terms to help them work through this period of elevated rates. So it's really been pressure at the point of purchase. The consequence of that is a lower transaction environment, a market that's much more weighted to cash, and equity-rich buyers, but it's also sort of fitted in with some sort of changing regulation that we've seen. So we have had a private rented sector which faces increasing levels of regulation. Those financial pressures have affected landlords. That's constraining the amount of available rental supply in the market, and that's driving rents up. So you have got a position as we approach the election that housing affordability is very clearly on everybody's minds. And I think the electorate here in the UK are looking for some solutions to that. At the moment, they're a bit thin on the ground. So again, I'm really interested to hear the experience of the other people on the call.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Andreas, I mean, in Germany, is the story pretty similar in terms of the way this is playing out?
Yeah, I mean, I'm afraid it's almost the same everywhere across Europe, and particularly in Germany, where you had a high influx of migrants during the past 6 to 8 years. Housing, particularly in the major conurbations, so Berlin, Munich, Frankfurt area, has become quite scarce. And again, mortgage rates have also gone up. I mean, Lucian has already talked about it, and I'm a good example for it. So I'm on a mortgage with a floating rate, and the rate has gone up 5 times. So luckily, I can afford it. But there are a lot of people in the market, particularly those who had a fixed rate, typical German fixed rate for 10 years, who fixed the rents, the rates on, I don't know, 2% plus margin back 8 years ago, and they now run into an environment where you have to pay 5, 6, or 7 all in, and in some cases this could cause a lot of issues. So this is for let's say the one side of the market, and when it comes to the rental markets, we also have these affordability discussions. The rent burden or housing cost ratio has gone up 6 percentage points since 2014. So on average, it's still somewhat okay, but the rental levels have gone up by more than the household incomes. And if you just think about the most sought after locations in Berlin and Munich, the housing cost ratios are far below 50%. So there's quite a high rent burden in some locations, and some people simply cannot afford it any longer.
Have you seen a pickup in repossessions? I mean, Lucian was pointing out in the UK we haven't. In Germany?
Sorry, I didn't get this question.
Pickup in mortgage repossessions of properties where people are unable to make their payments.
I think there are some negotiations going on in the background, but there is not a large number of it. Not to my knowledge, at least.
Okay, and I'm going to throw a bit of a curveball back at you here before I move on to Carol and Stephen. But you were talking about, particularly in the rental market, the issue of affordability. You mentioned, and Lucian's done likewise. And I know an issue that sort of periodically comes up is one of some sort of limitation on rent levels. I mean, Germany has some experience of this. I mean, how's that working in this environment? And would you recommend it? Is that a way of addressing this issue?
Difficult question. Thanks for raising it.
Do it.
Yeah, I know. You are putting a lot of pressure on me early in this discussion. No, joking aside. I mean, there have been a lot of measures like rent caps, rent control. To a certain extent, it makes sense to have some control measures in the rental market, but to put rental caps in place wasn't a very good idea, and it failed dramatically in Berlin. Just to give an example, as soon as the regional government put this in place, the supply dropped to almost zero. And this hasn't changed a lot, although our judges had something against this measure, let's put it that way. So it's not longer in place, but it still has some effects on the markets, and that means supply hasn't picked up since then. There's a lot of uncertainty that was created because of this now failed regulation.
It's interesting what you say there, because, you know, and again, I want to move around to Carol and then Stephen, but I know that, you know, and we perhaps will come back to Lucian's comments on this, but, you know, in the UK, politicians quite often see that as a perhaps, or some politicians see it as a short circuit to trying to address the affordability problem. Without perhaps fully understanding the ramifications of supply, which, you know, your example in Germany perhaps is quite a helpful sort of guide to the sort of the risks of going down that route. I mean, Carol, I mean, are you having similar conversations in France? First of all, I mean, have you seen a pickup in mortgage possessions, or is it sort of a bit like the UK story? And, you know, what about this issue of rental affordability?
Yes, on mortgages in France, we have only fixed interest rates. So that means that the problem is not as big as in some other countries. So we haven't seen that yet. In terms of rental affordability, there are two different markets, the free markets that we were talking about, and also in France, some cities have tried to regulate the prices, the rental prices. And then there is a regulated market on which we operate, CDC Habitat, with two different categories. The usual social housing that I guess exists in one form or another in every country. And of course, we know when we invest that we'll get a certain amount of subsidies and we'll get a low rent. So this is all good. And we have developed a new type of housing that we call intermediate. And since about 10 years, we have put that in place with the government. And this is in between social market and free market. And this has allowed us to develop some more housing for the middle class with some tax breaks and then some renting levels, some rental levels, which are at least 10% lower than free market rents. And this works very well. And this is one of the levers that has been used by the government in the recent months to increase the number of cities where this intermediate housing can be developed, and also to increase the different types of housings which are eligible to intermediate housing, such as the serviced apartments or managed residences. So this is on the rental affordability. Yeah.
Okay, so that's quite a different, that's a slightly different angle on how to perhaps address the issue. And Stephen, I mean, there are some sort of protected sort of properties in New York in terms of rents, aren't there? Well, isn't that quite a controversial issue?
Yes, I was a mayoral appointee to the New York City Rent Guidelines Board, and I served on that for 11 years. Thank you, Mayor Bloomberg. We deliberated about the renewal lease increases for 1- and 2-year leases for rent stabilized tenants, how much of an increase was going to be affected on their renewal leases. The statutorily protected tenants. We can go on for 3 or 4 hours about the benefits or challenges of a rent stabilization or rent control type of overview for municipality. But a couple of things I'd like to just clear first on the investment volume. See here, our housing market is multifamily or multi-housing and single family. And the U.S. multi-housing transaction volume slowed 62% year over year in 2023 from 2022. And from, if you want to compare it to 23 versus 2019, it's down 42%. So there's obviously challenges here with the investment market in multi-housing. But the U.S. national housing stock is structurally undersupplied long term. Since 2010, the imbalance has become really far more pronounced. And after the oversupply in the mid 80s, we had a chronic undersupply until about 2006, 2007, with a sharp decline in housing completions in the wake of the great financial crisis. And that's been lasting through today. We have an aggregate shortage of nearly 3.4 million housing units since 2008. So supply is significantly lagging the household formation demand generator. And further extending the supply squeeze is that about 90% of homeowners right now have mortgages rates below 6%. So that effectively stalls home resales as the typical upgrading or upsizing pattern is more expensive to carry than anticipated. So the share of those in-place mortgages, by example, the 90% of the households or the homeowners that have mortgages, 60% of those mortgages are below a 4% interest rate, and about half of those are about 3% or lower interest rate. So this effectively challenges the first-time home buyer because the existing starter home supply is stagnant, it's locked, and there's limited opportunity to enter the home ownership profile. However, today's mortgage rates are having an impact because although the 30-year mortgage rate has come in slightly from the second half 23 high point, home prices are sticky, and maintaining the record spread above renting and extending renter tenure. Currently owning a single family home is about 72% more expensive than renting an apartment nationally. That's hovering about an all-time high spread. Renting averages maybe at $1,750 US per month, while owning costs about $3,000 US per month, with the owning cost including principal, interest, property taxes, insurance, considering a 30-year fixed rate mortgage with a standard underwriting. And that's all based on a median price new house. And this is all national. This is not specific to location. And US home mortgage applications are at a near low level, lowest level probably since the mid-90s. So there's a lot of stress here.
Okay, thank you. And I mean, some interesting points there. I think, given what you said, Stephen, I think we probably do need to look at this, the issue of supply and, what can be done to begin to address, because I think each of you have identified a shortfall of supply, being one of the factors, certainly a major factor contributing to the affordability issue. Now, I just want to remind everyone, please do, who is listening in, please do put your questions or your points in the chat, and we will get to as many of them as possible. On the issue of supply, and just as a lead-in, we do have a question from Paddy, and he says, controversial as I know, but land is limited, and everybody's talking about, the affordability issue. Is it time to promote a declining population for all of us and accept the consequences for growth? Look, I mean, I think that the issue about land being limited is in itself, I mean, I was listening to a very well-known UK academic who questioned whether land was that limited because, it's about the communications or the transport communications to ensure that land is accessible and therefore is in play, so to speak, when it comes to this issue, the issue of housing. So that is, there is a debate around this. But look, I mean, in terms of the way in which government, developers, and perhaps most importantly, investors need to sort of respond to this current, or should be encouraged to respond to this current, the current challenge around supply. I mean, I'll be really interested now in gathering your thoughts on that one. So, I mean, look, Lucian, I mean, do you want to kick off this round?
Yeah, well, look, within the UK, it's widely considered that we need to be delivering about 300,000 homes a year. Actually, that's just in England, to meet current levels of demand and start to address some of the affordability issues. We never get close. We have a pretty restrictive planning system which inhibits the amount of property which is developed. We also have a very high reliance on a private sector house building model, who not only are responsible for delivering homes for private sale and to go into, say, the multifamily and single family market, but actually through planning obligations to deliver a lot of the new affordable housing. And I think the difficulty that we face is that is a very political system, both at a national and indeed at a local level, that tends to inhibit the delivery of homes. It is probably too restrictive in the UK. It's one of the reasons that we have very high house price to household income ratios within the UK, and it's one of the reasons why these affordability pressures build. And I think, fundamentally, one of the problems that we have is also a lack of consistency in housing policy. We have a raft of new housing ministers. In the UK, it's quite a junior ministerial role. People don't stay in post for that long, so they don't really get the opportunity to get to grips with the issues that are there. And as a consequence, we don't have a long-term coherent approach to the delivery of those homes. And that just creates a lot of difficulties and inefficiencies in the system. We've just had a situation in the UK where the major house builders were referred to the Competitions and Markets Authority. And the Competitions and Markets Authority essentially found that the issues lay in the planning system and the way that our land markets work. One of the reasons we have restrictions on the delivery of homes is actually a function of the planning system in which we operate. So I think there's a lot to be done. There's a lot to be done there to get those supply levels up.
But just coming back to you, Lucian, I mean, I looked at a long run chart, and this is for the UK, so we'll move on fairly quickly, but I want to just come back on the UK. I looked at a long run chart of private house builders development. I think it was like, perhaps 60 years or something like that. And typically it goes ups and downs, and there can be policies which incentivize it, but it seemed to sort of trend around 160K for the private sector. And then you've got your social and affordable, and you have your ups and your downs, as I say. But I wonder whether, and I know that the opposition Labour Party are talking about, potentially the next government are talking about changes to the planning system. We'll see if that actually happens, because we know what happens with all these grand ideas on planning. But is it just can we rely on private sector developers to turn this round? And what is the role perhaps of the investment community, do you think? I mean, do we have we know that they're sort of playing around with build to rent, but build to rent is still a tiny proportion of the rental stock. It's about 5%. So I'm just wondering, how do we get investors perhaps more involved in helping to turn things around? Because I have my doubts about the planning system being overturned in a way which on its own provides the incentive to change the narrative.
Well, I mean, I think if you are going to have a model which is very heavily driven by private sector housing delivery, then it needs to be operating in a policy environment which is conducive to the delivery of homes at volume. And I just don't think that's where we are at the UK. We have had periods when traditionally what happens is that for every 10 housing transactions, there's one new build property in the UK. That tends to be the capacity of the market which the private sector will build to. That's only really been broken in recent times when you had specific policies to help people buy new homes to get on the housing ladder, and that took the form of Help to Buy here in the UK. That scheme is no longer with us, and I think that just creates problems. When we were delivering homes in the UK was in the period post-war, and that's when you had high levels of public house building. But clearly, the nation's finances aren't in a state that can deliver that. So I think you're going to have to see some significant change in the planning system in terms of the role of investments. Increasingly, given some of the high barriers to entry around home ownership in the UK, and that's something that's very, very difficult to solve, then increasingly developers are working out that if they are going to up their production or maintain their production, they need a ready market to sell into. That ready market increasingly looks like it's a build-to-rent sector, but our build-to-rent sector or multifamily and single family is some way behind the US in terms of its maturity. We've started to build the models, but we don't operate at the same volume, nor indeed are we necessarily at the same volume in Europe. So I think you'll see big growth in that area, and I think it is a necessary part of getting housing supply up. Of course, to make that happen, we probably need interest rates to come down a bit just to make the returns stack up again. So, I would say in the recent past, Stephen talked about a fall in multifamily starts and investment that he's seen in the US. That's happened at a period where we've been quite early in the evolution of the build to rent sector. I think it will ramp up again when the finances stack up again, but let's see.
Okay, thank you, Lucian. I will turn to Andreas and Carol in a minute, but Lucian mentioned you, Stephen, and the US story around multifamily. I mean, is there something that we can learn in the UK and indeed perhaps Europe as well about how to get investors into this market in a material way that actually begins to change the face of the offer, really?
Yeah, well, it's not a demand issue. We certainly have more than enough demand. It's really the supply and how do you jumpstart that? I mean, the last low point in housing production in the U.S. was about 2011, where we had about 100,000 on annual completions. Then production ramped up every year through 2023 to about 450,000 units completed. And as I said before, we're going to hit a high point in 2024 with about 700,000 units. That's only about a 3.4 expansion in supply. However, it's going to drop back down to 400,000 units in 2025 and further drop to an annualized 200,000 units in both 26 and 27. That's only a nominal rate of supply expansion. It's more, I guess, in line with our historical supply expansion of, I guess, about 1.5%. But the housing starts and permits fell sharply. So we have completions in the pipeline, but our housing starts fell sharply from a November 2022 peak, which was the highest since the mid 80s, from about 600,000 to about 450,000. And now we're seeing about 1 out of every 3 projects experiencing start delays because of difficult construction and financing conditions. So it's one thing to say that, is it land prices? Is it something else? Depending on if you're going from free market to subsidized. If you're going to subsidized, you can give the land, but you're still going to need subsidies to have project feasibility for new construction. The construction costs are so high that you need municipal subsidies in order to meet project feasibility. The rents are just not high enough to meet those completion costs. It's a problem, and so you need in this country federal, state, local mandates to have either tax credits, real estate tax exemption program benefits, and even rental support. So it's an all hands on deck type of challenge that it's critical here. And if we had more supply, maybe it would be better, but we're far from meeting demand here.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Carol, I mean, from your perspective, then, I mean, can you? What is? And I was reading an article from Le Monde talking about the shortfall of supply and the imbalance. I mean, what is the process around getting more supply out there, and who is going to be? Who are the big players? Who's going to change the game? And I'm talking about on perhaps a more structural basis rather than a cyclical basis. We know interest rates will come down and developers like that, but that's not gonna, I can't see that being the game changer that gets us to where we want to be. So I mean, what are your thoughts around how we really ramp up?
Yes, I think there is no magic recipe, and in France at the moment we discuss about a lot of ways in which we could make the housing more affordable. Because why is there no more supply? It's because there is not enough demand. People cannot afford it, so developers don't get financing. So we need to get housing more affordable. In France at the moment, there is debate around 4 main areas where we could maybe reduce costs for the acquirer of housing. First, we talked about the mortgages. Not only lower interest rates, but also a different structure in mortgages. So we discussed about maybe for 20% of the price having a bullet mortgage that we don't have to reimburse, every year. That would make the cost more affordable for people buying a home. It's still under debate in France, but that's one area. The other area is around land price, which is not really regulated in France. So there is a lot of debate, but should we regulate it more? Because as in the UK, we have some regulations around the use of land, and even more so, as we have adopted a couple of years ago, a law that wants to decrease the artificialization of land, to protect biodiversity. And this is very important. So, but it will increase even more the price of land on which you can build. So there is a real debate to have around this, and because we'll have to have projects that are more dense, higher buildings in order to compensate for that. So mortgages, land prices. Then there is a lot of debate also around construction cost. And as you know, in times of crisis, that's where we see more innovation coming. And also developers are starting to think about new ways to build buildings, such as off-site production. How can you produce off-site? Sometimes it's not cheaper yet, but we think in the long term or in the medium term, maybe, when we have enough volume, it can be cheaper, and also you have a better quality, and also it's quicker. And as we know, time is money. So if you reduce the time to build a new building, it will also be cheaper at the end. And the fourth lever that we are looking at is around permitting and authorization and administrative processes. Again, in France, and I'm sure in other countries it's the same, it can take a lot of time. And you have to wait for authorization to launch your project during 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, and it can be very long. And here we think by shortening the delays, we could also reduce the cost, reduce the financing cost. And we have a very good example in Paris for the Olympic Games. We have built the whole 30 buildings will house the 14,000 athletes, and we managed to do that in just 6 years, where usually it would take 15 or 20 years to develop that, because we had some exemptions and specific authorization to launch this project and to manage this project very quickly, and also with very high environmental ambitions. And we are very proud of this project at CDC Habitat. We invested in half of the units that will come out of this area. So we know it can be very efficient to have some special authorization. So that's the fourth area where we look at in France.
Thank you, Carol. I mean, there's a couple of points that resonate. One is the issue of the additional costs that are being placed in the way of developers, and we've had a number of issues here about nutrient neutrality and all that sort of stuff being a relevant factor. But I am impressed by the turnaround on for the Olympics, and I think the UK or London was pretty successful with its development. But it's funny that it takes one of these high-profile, spectacular events to actually encourage the sort of the powers that be to actually speed up the process and all the permissions and things, and then they go back to normal, and everything crawls at a snail's pace. Andreas, I just wanted to get your thoughts again on the same sort of issue. So how do we get supply up? I mean, what are the thoughts in Germany about this?
I mean, they are quite similar to what has already been said from Stephen, Lucian, and Carol. So I don't want to speak too much about it. But in general and in short, housing construction in Germany is slow, regulated, and expensive. So it's everywhere the same. And your initial question, I think, was how can we convince investors to step into the market and create more supply? Yeah, I think. Two words are important here: predictability and reliability. And these are, in my opinion, the decisive factors. And if you have constantly changing housing policies on a national level, on a regional level, and on a local level, I mean, I wouldn't be convinced as an investor, as a developer, to step into the German, the French, the UK housing market. So that means I would say the most important factor is to create predictability and reliability. This goes up to the top and is a political decision, in my opinion, and all the other things discussed, less bureaucracy, sorry, hard word to pronounce for a German, and all the other things discussed, I think, comes second.
Okay, well, that's I think probably music to many of our ears, and I think that I think Lucian alluded, certainly as far as the UK is concerned, to the constant chopping and changing, and the fact that how a housing minister is certainly not there for any length of time, and I think usually 6 months, and then they're sort of off to do something else. So how can you have predictability and reliability against that background, certainly as far as the UK is concerned? Now, we've had another question which sort of links into supply, and I would like to, I think Stephen sort of mentioned in the previous conversation that there's something it was something that resonated with him, and I'm just thinking about conversions and the use of office space. I mean, we're all aware that there's this big polarization between best and the rest in offices, and a lot of offices perhaps going to not meet sort of the newer sort of sustainability requirements, going to fall short in terms of well-being, just not terribly not in the right location, whatever it is. I mean, is this an opportunity? Does it work? And I know I just preface that by saying RICS commissioned some work in the latter part of the last decade looking at some some early sort of work in this area in the UK, and a lot of the developments were quite poor quality. So we're hoping that as this process gathers momentum, that in the UK that it will be done better this time round. But I'm just wondering, I mean, how do you see this playing in terms of delivering the some of the additional supply required?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question, and we'll nod to the Big Apple here in New York City. Dealing with New York City's housing shortage and office space surplus, the office to residential conversions emerged as something trendy almost as soon as the pandemic hit about 4 years ago. But office to residential conversion is not a new concept for Manhattan. As the mid to late 90s saw a wave of these older office buildings, the stock primarily down the financial district, lower Manhattan, it was encouraged to be adaptively reused, and there was a targeted incentive program to really establish a 24/7-day-per-week residential enclave. I mean, after 5 o'clock, lower Manhattan, it was a ghost land. Nothing was going on. So this valuable real estate had to be re-energized somehow. So we had this obsolete office building stock, and it was encouraged to be transitioned. So we did about 13 million square feet of older Manhattan office space. That was roughly about 13% of the area's inventory, which is not insignificant. And that was converted into almost 13,000 apartments between 1995 and 2006, and chiefly with that incentive program. And in dollars and cents, I think the incentive program contributed just over $90,000 per unit on average. So it was potent, right? And thousands more units, however, were converted or developed in lower Manhattan without that incentive, post-incentive. And now, just the other day, it was announced that a seasoned converter secured a major office building, the former headquarters of the pharmaceutical giant Pfizer, and plans to convert that Midtown Manhattan office campus. So it's out of the, it's north of the downtown market, it's Midtown, into about 1,500 rental units. And this will be the largest single residential conversion in the city thus far. And this exceeds the ongoing project in the financial district back down in lower Manhattan of about 1,300 apartments at 25 Water Street. And other conversions in progress include a 588 unit project at 160 Water Street, 570 unit conversion at 55 Broad Street, again, located down in that financial district. And these are all without incentive programs. And the iconic Flatiron building at 23rd Street and 5th Avenue and Broadway, that's slated for conversion from office to residential. But
I like that building.
It's, the limitations are significant for a successful conversion. It includes the type of building, the core placement of the building, the fenestration, the floor plate with the width to depth ratio, and the ability to secure vacant possession. These are all factors that go into it. So it's not an easy path.
Can I just check? So the subsidies from the city, is it?
Yeah, that was
where there is a subsidy.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And has the quality been, I mean, are these seen as being quality developments? I mean, there's not been any subsequent sort of reevaluation of how they've been put together. People often talk about floor plates of offices not being well sort of, likely to be.
There was some challenge, yes, in some of the bizarre type of configurations, but that was rare. It did happen just to be able to piece things together. But the apartments they were all occupied, and they were all occupied at high market rents. Okay. And the level of fit out and finish is commensurate with the marketing program. Not every building is super luxury, but everything is at least at a luxury level, which I think has
interesting. That's interesting. Yeah. Okay, thank you. I mean, Andreas, are we seeing any of this in Germany?
I mean, generally, a lot of office buildings, particularly in fringe locations, are at risk to become obsolete. But are these the locations where people would like to live in? First question. I think it's also important, particularly if we look to the US, that the city's structure are slightly different here in continental Europe, and I believe in most of the UK cities as well. So you don't have this classic CBD location where only offices and some high street shops are located. So the continental European cities, and particularly also the German cities, have always been some kind of a mixed bag of usages. So offices next to shops, next to housing units, next to leisure and sports and the likes. So the classic office parks, so to say, they certainly are at risk, but they are usually outside cities or in certain parts of the cities where people usually don't want to live. So I'm a bit, let's say, exaggerating the situation, but it's that there are these discussions. But coming back to your question, I think only 10 to 15% of the overall office stock could be transformed or refurbished to residential. It's only one option for older offices to be converted into resi, it's not enough to meet the demand, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you. I mean, Carol, are we seeing any conversions in Paris and other big French cities?
There are a few. We have seen a few, and it is a trendy topic, as one of you said. So we are looking at the moment at a lot of potential projects with my team. But what we see is that there are so many constraints, as Stephen and Andreas said, that it does not work a lot of the time, because it has to be in the right location, it has to have the right size of building. But most importantly, financially, the equation rarely works, because the sellers, if they are not forced sellers, they are not ready to sell the office building at a price which is low enough in order to make the equation work. So that's the difficulty that we see in France at the moment. So we are seeing a lot of potential projects. Some of them work. It will help. It will help, but it's not the number one solution in front of us.
Okay, thank you. And Lucian, the UK perspective, I mean, it's clearly on the agenda. I mean, how's it playing out this time round?
Yeah, I mean, we've had some permitted development rights, which essentially shortcut the planning process for some from office to resi conversions. They haven't been particularly successful in the UK. They haven't necessarily resulted in great places to live, and I think fundamentally, that is the biggest problem. I mean, we also face some issues, I would say, more generally in that sort of competition for land. So what you find in the UK, for example, is increasingly the private house building model is required to have higher levels of affordable housing provision alongside that. For example, it also faces a whole number of additional sort of regulatory requirements, and that's sort of shifting the balance really between which is the most economically attractive use for that land. So if you push the thing too far, then actually what you find is the land that is probably best suited for housing doesn't end up going to housing, because it's more economical to put it into one of the other property industries, and that creates a tension, I would say, within the UK, where land is clearly the scarce resource. So I think we're going to need to see a whole host of more inventive ways of addressing this. I think we've picked on a few things here. Partly it's about the availability of the land and the development opportunities. That's clearly critically important. It's also about things like construction capacity. So Andreas sort of mentioned off-site construction, I think, as one area where we're going to need to see significant investment just to have the development capacity in the UK to meet the aspiration to deliver the higher number of homes. So there's a lot that needs to be addressed, I would say, in a pretty holistic approach to facing up to this.
And we've obviously had a few sort of off-site manufacturers who've gone under in the last year as well. So that highlights there's still a scale problem, and it's got some way to go as an industry to get it sort of established.
I thought, Carol's comments were really interesting there, because actually we can find a situation where off-site construction, at least in part, is more economic, or is as economic within the UK. The difficulty that you have is you need constant throughput through those factories, and if that is at the mercy of an inconsistent planning environment, or a market that ebbs and flows, it's quite difficult to meet that, if you like, to have the conditions right for that to flourish. So clearly there's some work there. I like the idea, Stephen, of a bit more sort of local and central government support to get these things moving. So if you could shove some of that US money our way, we'd be absolutely delighted. I don't think it's likely, but it would be a wonderful thing.
And I want one of those flats in the Flatiron.
Environment for the investment. That's
I want to move on. We had a question from Annabelle, which was about sustainability, and I think there's two aspects to this. One is in terms of new build and the standards that we're building towards, and also retrofitting. And there's been a lot of discussion about heat pumps. I also, because of the time, want to throw in another question on this, and this is mainly for the non-UK contributors, because we know the UK story, but Ben has asked about how political is the whole permissioning business in other countries. So we know it's very, planning here is pretty political, as Lucian's already alluded to. But I'm really interested in the sustainability agenda, and because the heat pump issue is so big, has been such a big story in Germany, perhaps we should start with Andreas.
I see I get the really nice questions today. So thank you again for this one. So, I mean, the heat pump discussion has been quite intensively discussed in the media. And I mean, we have to bring it down to the numbers, so to say. Yeah. So does it make sense to install a heat pump? Yes or no? I mean, I recently saw a very interesting documentary about it. And what my main takeaway was that even in poorly insulated, older housing units, a heat pump could make sense. When compared to an old oil or gas heat installation. So my take was, in the long run, it in a lot of cases makes sense to install a heat pump. Does it make sense to install it right now? Should you be forced to replace your working current system? I don't think so. So that means it will hopefully be some kind of a step-by-step approach that we will take.
Sorry, can I just ask, Andreas, is sustainability,
sure.
I mean, where is that ranking in terms of the new stock that's coming on the market? Is it, is it something that is very much to the fore, or?
Sorry, I mean, sustainability when it comes to new constructions is ranked very highly. So that is definitely true, yes. So that is number-one topic when it comes to new constructions, yeah, for sure.
Okay,
I don't have the green background for nominal. It's very much in the forefront here with LEED and WELL and a few of the other rating organizations. And green construction here is not more expensive than non-green construction. And if there is a delta, it's nominal. So the impetus here to develop with a green imprint is very high. And going to heat pumps, yeah, there's talk with municipalities phasing out fossil fuels, phasing out not only oil but natural gas, and converting to electricity. The rub here is that, is there enough electric capacity to really meet that type of demand? So that's the calculus that's being worked through here. But sustainability is it's disruptive, with municipalities putting fines together if the homeowner or the commercial property owner doesn't meet certain greenhouse gas reduction mandates and energy savings.
All right. I mean, Carol, I mean, in France, I mean, are new developments all being, when you're thinking about investing in developments, I mean, are they being, what's the spec? Is it all sort of with green facility, green sort of, functions or mechanisms attached to them, or are we still building very much to the old traditional style?
No, indeed, there is regulation that requires stricter and stricter norms in terms of energy consumption and also greenhouse gases emissions. But often investors ask even more than the regulations, because for them it's very important to demonstrate that they do sustainable investments in order to raise more money, to get the appropriate financing. So we saw that across all institutions, all investors, that really require standards which are higher than what is required by law. And for us at CDC Habitat, it's even more important, of course, because we are linked to this public body Caisse des Dépôts, and it's very core for us. And also we measure the economy of energy costs that the families that are in our units benefit from when we do this renovation program. So we have a lot of renovation programs for our existing stock over the next 10 years. As Andreas said, it's not a question of doing everything now. We have to plan for it in a reasonable way in order to reduce energy consumption, to install maybe more heat pumps, but also to connect to more heating networks. Often it's very efficient to do that. So it's, yes, indeed, something that we see more and more across the board.
And Lucian, what about the UK perspective? Because I'm sort of hearing sort of quite positive sort of comments about sort of, particularly new supply. I mean, I take on board Andreas's comment about the challenges of imposing those sort of standards around retrofitting in the short time span. And but is the UK on the same sort of trajectory?
Well, I think in terms of new stock, yes, but the problem is not with the new stock. The problem is with the retrofit and how you have an accelerated retrofit program to reduce the carbon emissions from housing, which in the UK are 17% of CO2 emissions. And there, I think, we haven't really got the policy environment to get the investment in at the pace that it's needed. We flirted with minimum energy performance standards for our let stock. We didn't really follow through on that. I think it will come. We've had long outstanding consultations on setting lenders' targets for the green credentials of their loan book, which could affect the terms upon which you can get mortgage debt. That clearly would start to change some of the economics of investing in your home to improve its energy efficiency, but that seems to have been kicked into the long grass as well. And we do face, some of the problems that Andreas alluded to. There is just this, we'll do it, but when we'll do it when we think the technology is right, and when we've perhaps got over some of this skepticism, for example, about the way in which heat pumps work and whether they can actually do the job of a gas boiler. Now, they're never going to do the same job as a gas boiler, but there needs to be a bit of change in mindset. But we've just got this, we've got some issues around fears of technical obsolescence, whether it's the right thing, and that's holding it back. But, if there's one area we need to turbocharge in housing, then it's the retrofit of our existing housing stock in the UK.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. And look, just as a final sort of word on this, because I mean we were pretty much out of time, so perhaps I'm going to start with Lucian because you're on camera, so to speak. But if there was one initiative you could introduce with a magic wand around housing to change what's been happening and to really improve both the quality, the supply, and indeed the quality of supply, which we haven't had time to address today, I mean, what would it be? What's the single most important issue as far as you're concerned?
I think you need to depoliticize the process as much as you possibly can, so that you end up with more, it's more rational decision making, which is not driven by local politics or party politics, and that's that requires a lot more use of things like development corporations, and hopefully that would foster a more coherent policy. I mean, ideally what you would like is some cross-party support on the way forward with a strong housing commission in the UK. Then you can start to get to grips with the problems and have a much better joined up approach. So for me, I would depoliticize it as much as is possible.
I think that chimes with Ben's comments. Let professionals make the decisions, not the politics. So that's an interesting sort of alignment of views. Carol, I mean, if you were to pick one factor that would sort of move the dial in France in terms of housing.
I would come back to simplify and accelerate the processes around administrative authorization, but keeping the part of the consultation with the inhabitants, because indeed we build also for the inhabitants of the city, so that has to remain, but simplifying and accelerating processes, because time is money.
Thank you. Andreas, your final word?
I just can repeat myself. Predictability and reliability are key for me, and I mean, it requires a coordinated efforts from governments, developers, investors, broader public and private housing sectors. So that's what I think could help, at least in the mid to longer run.
Thank you. And Stephen?
Yeah, it's not the political fractioning that's keeping it. Well, I guess it can be seen as keeping it, but we need a political will. And the political will has to be pulling in the same direction. And we've seen very good success here with public-private partnerships. And again, so long as there is a concerted motion towards developing housing, and we don't get in our own way, that's what I see as the best way to start to close the gap.
Okay, thank you. Well, look, we have run out of time. In fact, we've gone over time, so I apologize for those of you who needed to be away on the dot. But look, thank you very much to my panelists. I mean, really insightful conversation, lots of great thoughts, and hopefully we can take this away. I know at RICS, we're trying to do some work around sort of housing, so I'm sure this is going to feed into those conversations. Also, big thank you to the audience. Many of the questions we didn't get around to answering, and I do apologize for that. Thank you for all of you who did post, and thank you for listening in for the last hour or so. We will be publishing a recording, and there will be a written summary of this webinar online. Also, of course, do please feel free to share both of those, I should say, with your professional networks. At the end of the session, there will be an online poll, and we would certainly appreciate if you could complete it. It really does help us to understand what you found valuable and what you'd like to see more of. We do have a number of other webinars coming up over the next couple of months. You can see those on the screen. There's going to be something on public procurement projects, in particular from my perspective, something about office space, because I'm moderating that one, and it obviously overlaps a little bit with some of the conversation we've had here, and then something on reimagining retail, which could be very interesting. So some future dates for your diary. We continue to be able to find lots of articles and discussions exploring the big issues, and they're all available on rics.org/WebEF. And again, if you are if you do require any further information, visit that website, or you can find the Well-Built Environment Forum on LinkedIn. Look, thank you very much for attending, and I hope you found it an interesting hour and a bit. Thank you.
Thank you.